really honored to be here. And I'm really inspired by the topic, shining a light on our changing communities. So I want to talk to you about one community that you probably are not that familiar with, and that is, at least I hope you're not, and that's the community inside Ontario's jails. And I also want to talk about a particular way of shining the light there, and that's writing for therapeutic benefit. Actually, there, not just there, but also for all of us. So I don't just teach therapeutic writing with inmates. I've taught it to court-ordered youth. I've taught it to sexual assault survivors. I've taught it to palliative care patients, cancer patients, their caregivers. And I've taught it many, many, many times to normal populations, although my abnormal psych professor always said that normal was just a setting on the dryer. Yeah, except for thee and me, right? So anyway, so I was really excited to be teaching in the jails because I had seen the therapeutic value of writing so often. And it was actually 8.5 years ago now, I did the recalculation that I did my volunteer security training and I skipped down that long concrete hallway and bounced into the female unit. I was so excited to be there, to be bringing this program, which I knew would help the women, and I was expecting that everybody there was going to be really excited too, right? Like, wahoo! Well, not so much. The volunteer coordinator introduced me to the guards, who were watchful and kind of disapproving. And then later on, as I came in over and over again to do it, and she wasn't there to run interference for me, they were actually quite hostile. And I found myself getting kind of puzzled by this and then irritated, and actually in a couple of times over all those years, sort of frightened by this. So that was my introduction to the jail. I want to give you a little introduction to the jail, and I want to do it by reading some of the inmates' writing, one of the inmates' writings, where she describes the jail. So I just invite you, she gives a very physical description of this, so I invite you to even close your eyes for a minute and just visualize this. I am living in a jail cell that is 15 feet long and 8 feet wide. There are 2 3-foot wide single beds on each side. They are each 6 feet long. There's not quite 3 feet of distance between each. At the end of one of the beds, there's an open toilet, so no privacy. This takes up another 3 feet. Then you have a sink and a metal mirror at the cell door. We haven't even added clothes, personal effects, or books yet. You know why? Because we have to make room for a third person. She's new in the cell, so she gets the floor. We have to find room for another mattress, which is 3 feet wide, 3 inches thick, and 6 feet long. Now the fun begins. In each cell are 3 women from all races and all walks of life. Some are bullies. There's some coming off drugs who are deathly ill. Some who have respect for others, some who don't. Some who are clean, hygiene-wise, some who are not. Some who are mentally challenged. Some who are scared, who don't know this corrupt system and how to work it. Also, on top of this, we are locked in our cells 16.5 hours a day. We have to eat in our cells. Close your eyes and imagine being in a confined space with one of the women, or both, disliking you. Do the words stress, mental breakdown, or suicide occur to you? Also, when you're out in the community, you may take medication for anxiety, bipolar, methadone, sleep, pain, etc. Well, hang on, because in here, it could be tomorrow, it could be 3 weeks from now, it could be not at all. So that's the range. That's the cells. In each range, there are 9 cells arranged around it. As you heard, the women spend 16.5 hours in their cells. The rest of the time, they come on the range, which has a TV and, bare bones, screwed to the floor, metal tables and chairs. That's it. I want to talk for a moment about the women prisoners, who they are. I call them criminalized women, as you might have noticed, and not criminals. And that's because women offend for very different reasons than men do. They're very different populations. If they weren't, there would be 51% of women in the jails, just like there are on the outside. But that's not the case. Inside jails and prisons, the women represent 7%. And of those, Only 3.5% are actually serving their sentences. The others are waiting to get their sentences, waiting to go to trial, and you can wait a long time to go to trial, or they're waiting to be transferred to federal custody. So how do they end up in there? Well, research shows us that women end up in jail usually because of long histories of physical and sexual abuse as children and as adults. They end up there because of substance abuse, addiction, and because they live in poverty with their children because of poor education. And of course, the addiction then leads to more problems. They become addicted to numb from their backgrounds, and then they need money for their addiction, and that's where the crime comes in. Elizabeth Fry asked women prisoners what they needed to stay out of trouble, and they listed some very specific and very practical things. They need help with emotional matters, they need help with employment, they need housing, they need help with their children and childcare, and they need work training. And you probably think that they get some of that in jail, right? You probably think that they're in there for rehabilitation. You'd be sorely mistaken. There's a culture inside the jail amongst the guards which is very anti-rehabilitation. I just want to pause here because I'm going on record, I know, and I want to be on record as saying that there are some superheroes in the jail where I work. There are men and women who care deeply about the people who are in their charge, who are compassionate and professional and do everything they can to give them the best care possible and the best treatment possible. And for that, they are ostracized by their colleagues, they're labeled inmate lovers. Life is made very difficult for them. So, I also want to talk about the programming in the jail for a moment. As you heard, they're only out of their cells for a few hours a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, 2 hours after dinner. The after dinner is really not useful for programming because they're given their drugs early in the evening to sedate them for the night, and by the time that AA or NA come in, they're nodding off, they can't concentrate. So you're down to 5.5 hours of possible programming in a day. There's almost no programming space. All the programs are done, almost all the programs are done on a volunteer basis. So first of all, you have to get the volunteers in there, and then you have to have space to do it, and there is an absolute dearth of space. So, not much programming. So I want to talk about the writing program. Women who come to the writing program for the first time come, you'll not be surprised to hear this, usually out of boredom. There's not much going on in there. Or they come because someone who's already done this tells them that they have to try it. It's amazing. And it's true that once they try it, they usually come back over and over again until they're released. So why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that the writing protocol we do takes people deeply into their specific memories and experiences. And as one inmate said to me, it's like when we're in here, meaning the writing group, we're not in here, like the jail. For those few minutes, they are once again living outside, living with their families, living with their children. So you can see the attraction of that, right? A little legal escape for a short time. I did my undergrad thesis with the women in the jail, and it was a series of interviews with them, qualitative research about their experience in the writing program. I wanted to understand why they did this, why they came back over and over again. And the outcomes fell under 4 major headings. The first one is emotional release. Women in jail, women on the range, are really discouraged from showing any kind of negative emotions. As one of the inmates said to me, we all feel bad in here. We don't want to see you feeling bad. Also, it's a sign of weakness. So they come in the writing class, and because there's a specific structure in place, a very safe structure, they read their words, and they often cry as they do so. One of the experienced inmates, one of the inmates who came in said that it was such a relief to cry, that she hadn't cried since she came into the jail. And she was just feeling so bound up all the time. And one of the really experienced inmates, somebody who'd been over and over and over again, said to her, advised her very kindly that you could go into the shower and cry if you needed to. That was the other safe place to do it. So the writing class, there's a safe place for the expression of emotions, and I want to stress it's not just negative emotions, it's not just crying. We do a lot of laughing, and that's also a tremendous emotional release for them. And this kind of emotional release doesn't just happen with inmates. It happens in all the writing groups I do. People often say to me, I don't understand it. I think of myself as a really happy person. Why do I go to the dark places right away? But I think it's because in our social lives, there isn't a place to put that sadness outside of the therapeutic situation. Outside the therapy office, people are really uncomfortable with tears, with expression of emotion. They don't know how to handle it. But in the writing protocol, there's a place for this. People are just given time to breathe, to find their voice, to finish their reading. The next outcome was that it fostered sympathy, it fostered empathy, and it fostered good relationships. So I want to read you a quote from one of the inmates' interviews. She says, and you have to remember that language is very fresh, "You could have somebody on range who just walks around all day acting like a total idiot, you know, and you think, ew, if she was on fire, I wouldn't piss on her to put her out. And then they write something and you're like, oh my God, she has a soul. Everybody can be a good person or a bad person. So if you see that bad person first, you don't want to get to know them. But you get to know their good side in creative writing because you kind of have to, because they get a chance to talk." And another inmate said, "It's happened where somebody I thought, oh, they would never be my friend on road. Why would I want to get to know them? After hearing the stuff they wrote, all I wanted to do was talk to them for the rest of the time." And it's not just the inmates themselves. Occasionally, not often, but occasionally we get the staff coming in to write with us. And I had a social worker, head of social work, come in and write with us one day. She told me later that she'd had paperwork on her desk for one of the participants in the group that day. It was about childcare access for the parole board. And she said her result, her recommendations were much more favorable than they would have been before she'd been in that writing group with the woman. So she herself, her eyes were opened up. After the first 2 years I worked there, I began typing up the women's writing. I told them that we'd consider putting it in a little chapbook, which we did. That's the piece that I read from. And that became this incredible ambassador for the women. First of all, when they saw their words in type, they would say things like, "I've never seen my words in typewriting before. This sounds like a real writer," or "This looks like a real writer wrote it." And then when the chapbook was published, they sent it to their family, they sent it to their friends, they gave it to their lawyers, and it became an ambassador on the outside. The guards read it, and some of them said that they saw the women with totally new eyes when they'd heard their stories. Our stories make us human. So a third theme was that the writing became a therapeutic intervention. This was available to the women 24/7. They took away journals that they were given, and they wrote in their cells afterwards, and they wrote after they left the jail. Some of my interviews were done with participants after they'd left the jail. And one participant who had been a heroin addict said to me, "What do you think it means that I'm always writing around like midnight, late at night?" And I said, "I don't know. What would you normally be doing?" And she laughed and said, "No, using." I said, "Well, I think that's your answer." And then she also went further and said that she often reads her poetry about the times when she was using and thinks, wow, I don't ever want to go back there. And the last theme was that writing let the women claim their stories. Feminist researchers say that it is critical for women to claim their narratives, and it's critical for them to construct a self by claiming their narratives. So I have one quote from an inmate that I think really illustrates this. "It made me feel really good. I got all this attention just from writing a poem, which I thought was a stupid little thing. He's not around. I don't have to be put down no more. I'm going to do more writing. I can express myself and put it down. And nobody is ever going to tell me again that I'm worthless and I can't do anything." You have to remember that many of these women come from abusive situations in the past and the present. But why do I call this presentation Writing Our Way Out of Trouble? because it's not just in prisons. This applies to all of us. I've been teaching writing for 15 years, and I know that anecdotally, probably many of you in the audience have had this sensation, if you're in trouble, that you want to go to your journals, that you want to write it down, that it makes you feel better. Well, it's not just anecdotal. There are 25 years worth of research that show us that this is the case. This man, Dr. James Pennebaker, 25 years ago, was doing research into post-traumatic stress disorder. And he noticed that people, his research supported what we've known since the 1950s, that people who have had exposure to stress are much more likely to develop minor and major illnesses, that the stress worsens disease. But he also noticed this really interesting phenomenon, which was that if the people had had the stress and never talked to anyone about it, never expressed themselves, that they were much more likely to develop major disease. So he began to do experiments with this. He did an experiment with students where some of them wrote for 20 minutes on just a general topic, and others wrote on topics that really distressed and dismayed them, traumatic events that had happened to them. And then he tracked their health over the next few months. And for all you overworked healthcare providers in the audience, you'll be delighted to hear that people who wrote about what distressed and dismayed them were 43% less likely to visit the doctor for flus and upper respiratory illnesses. He published his findings. Other people got really interested, and they began doing other studies. They found that writing about what distresses and dismays you increases your white blood cell count and your immune system. It reduces pain for people with rheumatoid arthritis. It reduces symptoms of asthma. It reduces depression and anxiety. Across the boards, pretty much, it was positive outcomes. And I have seen it with the people I write with. They feel better. They claim themselves. So my real message here, my messianic message is, I want to encourage everyone to write. If you're a social service provider, I want you to go out and try this method of writing in groups with non-judgmental, validating feedback with your clients. And if you yourself, it's not if, we all have lives full of small or large heartbreaks. We all encounter very difficult things. I want to encourage you to do your own debriefing. I want you to write about that fight you have with your husband or your wife or your teenage child. I want to encourage you to write about the sister you've lost or the father. I want to encourage you to write about your heartbreaks, about your secret shames. I want to encourage you to write it down, to get it out, to let it go. Thank you.